The sun hung high over Los Angeles, casting golden light over the towering buildings and the ever-bustling streets. At a prestigious university in the heart of California, students gathered in excitement, their eyes flickering with anticipation. A special guest was about to arrive, someone who had not only shaped the music industry but had also become a voice for the voiceless. Kendrick Lamar, the Pulitzer Prize-winning rapper, songwriter, and poet, had accepted an invitation to speak to the students about his struggles before success. The news had spread like wildfire across campus. Young minds, eager to grasp wisdom from one of the most influential artists of their generation, packed the auditorium, their spirits alive with curiosity. As the clock ticked closer to the scheduled time, the air was filled with murmurs of speculation. Some wondered if he would speak about his childhood in Compton, where gang violence and poverty loomed like dark clouds. Others hoped to hear about his rise to stardom, how he overcame obstacles to redefine the landscape of hip-hop. And then the moment arrived. The doors at the back of the hall opened, and in walked Kendrick Lamar. Dressed in a simple black hoodie and jeans, his presence was magnetic. His energy was calm yet commanding, and as he approached the podium, the room fell into an eerie silence. With a slight nod, Kendrick adjusted the microphone and gazed at the sea of faces before him. He took a deep breath and began to speak. I was once where you are, full of questions, searching for direction, trying to understand where my life was headed. His voice, smooth yet powerful, resonated through the auditorium, drawing in every listener. And so his story began. Kendrick Lamar paused for a moment, scanning the eager faces in the crowd. He leaned slightly toward the microphone, his tone shifting to something deeper, something more personal. I was born in Compton, California. If you know anything about Compton, you know it ain't the easiest place to grow up. My childhood was shaped by everything around me. Violence, gang culture, and the constant struggle of trying to survive. A hush fell over the auditorium as students leaned forward, captivated by his words. My parents moved from Chicago to Compton before I was born, hoping for a better life. But Compton wasn't easy. It was a place where, if you weren't careful, you could get caught up in something that wasn't meant for you. And believe me, I saw it all. I saw friends lose their lives to gang violence before they even had a chance to dream. I saw people get caught up in drugs, thinking it was their only escape. And I saw families, good families, struggle to put food on the table. Kendrick's eyes softened for a moment as he reflected. But you know what? In the middle of all that struggle, there was something else. There was music. There was storytelling. There was poetry in the streets if you listened closely enough. He shifted slightly, glancing at a few students in the front row. I was just a kid when I saw Tupac and Dr. Dre filming the California Love video in my neighborhood. I didn't know then that I'd be following in their footsteps, but that moment, it stuck with me. It made me realize that even in Compton, even in the struggle, there was a way out. He let his words sink in before continuing. But don't get it twisted. Knowing there's a way out and finding that way out are two different things. The students listened intently, some nodding, others lost in thought. Kendrick was giving them more than just a story. He was painting a picture of what resilience looked like. Kendrick Lamar took a sip of water before continuing, his voice steady but filled with emotion. When you grow up in a place like Compton, you don't always have the luxury of dreaming. Survival comes first. But somehow, even as a kid, I felt this urge, this need to express what I saw, what I felt. I didn't know it at the time, but I was learning how to tell stories. He glanced around the auditorium, eyes scanning the students who sat on the edge of their seats. I wasn't the toughest kid. I wasn't out there trying to be something I wasn't. What I had was my notebook. I started writing poems, little rhymes that reflected the world around me. It was my way of making sense of everything. The struggle, the pain, the moments of joy that were too few and far between. He chuckled, shaking his head as if recalling a distant memory. I remember being in middle school, writing verses during class instead of paying attention. My teachers would catch me, but they didn't shut me down. Some of them even encouraged me. They saw something in me that I hadn't yet recognized in myself. Kendrick paused, letting the weight of his words settle. One of the first times I really understood the power of words was when I let my mom read some of my rhymes. She looked at me and said, "Boy, you got something special." And in that moment, I believed it. Sometimes, all it takes is one person believing in you before you believe in yourself. A few students in the crowd nodded, resonating with his words. He smiled slightly before continuing. I started taking it seriously. I studied the greats Tupac, Biggie, Nas, Jay-Z. I listened to their words, their stories, the way they painted pictures with their lyrics. And I told myself, if they can do it, maybe I can too. His voice grew firmer. But talent alone don't get you nowhere. It's discipline. It's persistence. It's working when nobody else is watching. And let me tell you, there were a lot of nights when nobody was watching. The room was silent, every student captivated by the raw honesty in his voice. Kendrick Lamar shifted his weight, his voice calm yet filled with intensity. Let me tell y'all something. Talent is a gift, but success is work. Ain't nobody handing it to you. You gotta earn it every single day. The students nodded in agreement, some scribbling notes, others simply absorbing his words. I was 16 when I first got into the studio, if you could even call it that. It was a small setup in the back of my friend's house. A cheap mic, a laptop, and a dream. But that was all I needed. I started recording nonstop, writing verses day and night. I wasn't making money. I wasn't famous. Hell, half the time, I didn't even know if anybody was listening. But I kept going. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment before continuing. There were times I felt like giving up. Times when my homies were out doing their thing, having fun, and I was stuck in a tiny room, writing bars that might never see the light of day. But I had this fire in me, man. Something telling me that if I kept going, if I kept pushing, one day, it would all make sense. Kendrick chuckled softly, shaking his head. Y'all ever hear that saying, "You gotta sacrifice now to shine later"? I lived that. While other kids were running the streets, I was at home, listening to beats, perfecting my flow, trying to figure out who I was as an artist. I wasn't out there chasing quick money or shortcuts. I was building something real. His expression turned serious again. One of the hardest parts of chasing a dream is dealing with doubt. Not just your own doubt, but the doubt of others. People telling me, "You really think you're gonna make it out of Compton? You think you special?" And I'd be lying if I said that didn't get to me sometimes. But every time I felt that doubt creeping in, I reminded myself, this ain't just about me. This is about my family, my city, my people. He paused and looked out at the crowd. And let me tell you something. When you have a why bigger than yourself, nothing can stop you. The students erupted into applause, his words striking a chord with every aspiring dreamer in the room. Kendrick Lamar smiled briefly, nodding as the applause settled. His voice softened slightly, carrying a tone of gratitude. You know, when you're grinding in silence, when you're putting in all that work with no guarantee it'll pay off, you start wondering, when's my time? When will all this effort turn into something real? He paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. For me, that moment came when I dropped my first mixtape, Youngest Head Nigga in Charge, back when I was just 16. It wasn't some overnight sensation. Nah, but it got people talking. It made folks start paying attention. He exhaled deeply, remembering those early days. I was just a kid, hungry, ambitious, but still learning. I went by K. back then. That name? It was my way of trying to fit in, trying to prove I could be just as hard as the dudes around me. But deep down, I knew I had more to say. His eyes scanned the crowd. You ever get that feeling? Like you're meant for something bigger, but you ain't quite figured out how to say it yet? That was me. I had the talent, but I was still searching for my truth. He leaned in, his tone more personal. It wasn't until I started being real with myself, stripping away the image, the expectations, the fear, that things really started changing. A few students nodded, fully engaged in his words. And that's when I made a decision. I was done hiding, done playing a role. I dropped K. and stepped into my real name, Kendrick Lamar. The students murmured, understanding the weight of that shift. That's when things got serious. I started working harder than ever, dropping mixtapes, linking up with Top Dog Entertainment, learning from people who saw something in me that I didn't even see yet. He smiled again, this time with a glint of amusement. And man, I thought I was working hard before? Nah, that was just the warm-up. The auditorium buzzed with energy as students absorbed his words, eager to hear what came next. Kendrick Lamar let the moment linger, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. His expression turned serious, reflecting on the struggles that came after his breakthrough. Let me tell y'all something, getting your foot in the door is one thing. Staying in the game? That's a whole different battle. The students leaned in, sensing the weight of his words. After I linked up with Top Dog Entertainment, I was in the studio every single day, sun up to sundown. No shortcuts, no distractions, just work. People think once you get noticed, the hard part is over. But that's when the real work begins. He shook his head, recalling the sleepless nights. There were times I felt like I was losing myself in the process. I wasn't out partying, I wasn't living wild. I was locked in, focused. But it came with sacrifices. I missed birthdays, family gatherings. I lost friends. Some folks didn't understand why I was so serious about this. His voice grew softer, yet more intense. I had to remind myself, this wasn't just about music. This was about making a difference. About telling stories that mattered. About giving people hope when they felt like they had none. The auditorium was dead silent, every student hanging on to his words. And then came the moment that changed everything when I dropped section .80. That was my first real introduction to the world. I poured my soul into that album. Talked about everything I'd seen, everything I'd felt. And for the first time, people outside of Compton were listening. He paused, shaking his head as if he still couldn't believe it. But success? It don't come without its own set of challenges. The more people listening, the more pressure you feel. And let me tell y'all, there's no handbook for fame. No guidebook for what to do when the world suddenly has eyes on you. A few students nodded, understanding that fame wasn't always what it seemed. But you know what kept me grounded? My purpose. I wasn't just making music for money, for clout. I was doing it for my city, for the kids who looked like me, for the ones who needed to hear that they could make it out. He sighed, rubbing his hands together before looking back at the crowd. That's what kept me going. And that's what's gonna keep you going, your purpose. If you don't have that, all the success in the world won't mean a damn thing. The students erupted into applause, his words striking deep. Kendrick Lamar took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room as the applause faded. Success. It's a blessing, but it's heavy. Real heavy. You think you're working hard to get here? Wait until you feel the pressure of staying here. The students sat in silence, absorbing the weight of his words. After section .80, everything changed. I went from being a kid from Compton with a dream to someone the industry was watching. I had to move different, think different. People started treating me different. His voice slowed, carrying a deep sense of reflection. At first, it's exciting. The money, the fame, the recognition. But then you start asking yourself, who am I really doing this for? Am I making music for myself? For my people? Or am I trying to fit into what the industry wants me to be? He shook his head. That's the battle nobody prepares you for. The battle to stay you when the world is trying to mold you into something else. He paused, his voice dropping to a lower tone. And let me be real with y'all. I almost lost myself. The industry will chew you up if you ain't careful. I had to take a step back. I had to remind myself why I started. His gaze locked onto a few students in the front row. And that's when Good Kid, Mad City happened. A murmur spread through the crowd at the mention of the legendary album. That album? That wasn't just music. That was my story. That was me going back to my roots. Telling the world what it meant to grow up in Compton. To be surrounded by temptation, by struggle, by choices that could define your whole life. He clenched his fists slightly, as if reliving those moments. That's when I realized something important. Your story is your power. Nobody else has your experiences. Nobody else has your voice. And if you stay true to that, can't nobody take it from you. He straightened up, his voice firm. So whatever y'all are chasing, whether it's music, business, art, sports, remember this. Stay true to you. Because the moment you start changing to fit someone else's expectations, you lose what makes you special. A roar of applause erupted in the auditorium, students visibly moved by his words. As the applause settled, Kendrick Lamar took a step back, his expression turning more reflective. See, once I found my voice, my real voice, I knew I had a responsibility. It wasn't just about making music anymore. It was about using it to create change. The students listened intently, knowing they were about to hear something profound. When I dropped To Pimp a Butterfly, people were expecting another good kid, Mad City. Something personal, something storytelling. But I had something bigger on my mind. He shook his head, his tone growing more intense. I was watching what was happening in the world. The protests, the injustice, black men and women getting killed for no reason. And I couldn't just sit there and pretend like it wasn't happening. My music had to reflect that. A few students nodded, recalling the cultural impact of the album. To Pimp a Butterfly wasn't just an album. It was a statement, a challenge, a call for people to wake up. And when All Right became an anthem for the Black Lives Matter movement, that's when I knew this was bigger than me. He paused, letting the words sink in. I want y'all to understand something. When you make it, when you find success, you got a choice. You can sit back, enjoy the money, stay comfortable. Or you can use your voice, your influence, to make a difference. He nodded firmly. I chose the second option. Because if I wasn't speaking for my people, for my city, for the ones who didn't make it out, then what was all this for? The auditorium was silent, the weight of his words pressing down on every student. Whatever you do, whether it's music, business, education, whatever, don't just chase success. Chase impact. Make sure what you do leaves the world better than how you found it. The students erupted in applause, some even standing in admiration. Kendrick let the moment breathe, knowing he had struck a nerve. As the applause echoed through the auditorium, Kendrick Lamar took a deep breath, letting the energy settle. His gaze softened, his voice carrying a sense of wisdom. You know, for a long time, I thought success was about making it out, proving everybody wrong. And yeah, that's part of it. But what I've learned, what I had to learn, is that success ain't just about where you end up. It's about who you become along the way. The students leaned in, sensing this was about to be one of the most personal parts of his speech. See, after To Pimp a Butterfly, after the awards, the recognition, all of it, I still felt something missing. I started asking myself, am I happy? Am I at peace? And I had to be real with myself. The answer was no. He shook his head, his expression serious. Because here's the thing. Chasing success will drive you crazy if you don't know when to slow down, when to check in with yourself, when to take a step back and breathe. He looked out at the students, many of whom were nodding, resonating with his words. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I stepped away. I stopped making music for a while. I traveled. I spent time with family. I reflected. And that's when I realized everything I had been looking for outside of me, in awards, in recognition, in money, it was something I had to find inside myself. A hush fell over the room as Kendrick continued. That's what led me to Damn. That album? That was me looking in the mirror, facing my own demons, my doubts, my fears, and learning how to overcome them. His voice deepened, becoming even more intentional. Because here's the truth, y'all, no amount of success, no amount of money, no amount of fame will mean anything if you don't know who you are. He let the silence stretch, giving the students time to process his words. So my advice to you, whatever you're chasing, whatever your dream is, don't lose yourself in the process. Check in with yourself. Make sure your success isn't just external but internal too. Because at the end of the day, peace of mind is the real prize. A few students clapped softly at first. Then the applause grew louder, echoing throughout the auditorium. Kendrick let the moment sit, his message delivered with raw honesty. As the applause settled, Kendrick Lamar stepped forward, gripping the edges of the podium. His expression was calm, yet the fire in his eyes remained. I know some of y'all sitting here right now thinking, that's Kendrick Lamar. He made it. His story ain't my story. And you're right. Your story is your story. But let me tell you something. It don't matter where you from, what you up against, or how many people doubt you. If you believe in your vision, if you're willing to put in the work, you can go farther than you ever imagined. His words rang through the auditorium like a challenge, an invitation for the students to see their own potential. But here's the truth. Talent alone won't get you there. Passion alone won't get you there. You gotta be disciplined. You gotta be obsessed with your craft. You gotta be willing to fail, to learn, to get back up every time life knocks you down. He nodded firmly, the weight of his own journey reflected in his voice. And when you get there, because I believe some of y'all will get there, don't forget where you came from. Don't forget the people who helped you. Don't forget to give back. Because success means nothing if you ain't lifting others up along the way. The students erupted into applause, some standing, others cheering, completely moved by his message. Kendrick smiled, humbled by their reaction. He let the moment breathe before finishing with one final thought. So go chase your dreams. Go break barriers. Go prove yourself to yourself. And no matter how big you get, always remember. Stay real, stay humble, stay hungry. The auditorium thundered with applause, a standing ovation sweeping through the crowd. Kendrick nodded in gratitude, stepped back from the podium, and gave a simple but powerful wave before walking off stage. His story had been told. His message had been received. And in that room, in that moment, futures were being rewritten, one inspired student at a time.